The first time we heard him, it was a soft strangled whimper beneath the metallic groan of the old tractor. The air smelled of rust, oil, and wet earth, a bitter tang that made the back of my throat tighten. My boots sank into the mud as I crouched lower, straining to see into the shadows beneath the massive machinery. There was a trembling, a tiny heartbeat wrapped in fur and fear, and it made the air itself hold its breath. Every instinct screamed to pull him out, but the fear in his eyes, the raw, unspoken terror, froze me in place. How long had he been there? Hungry, alone, abandoned by a world that didn't notice the quiet, small voices. The sound came again, more urgent this time, a fragile cry that seemed to echo against the worn metal and through the hollows of my own chest. In that instant, the world narrowed to one point. A tiny German shepherd, shivering under the weight of the old tractor, and us, two strangers who suddenly carried the responsibility of a life in our hands. Time slowed, the wind held still, and I realized rescue isn't just about reaching, it's about understanding the story waiting in the silence. The storm had passed, but its memory lingered in the air like a bitter perfume. The countryside lay sprawled in exhaustion, mud puddles reflecting the gray, swollen clouds that refused to disperse. Trees leaned at odd angles, roots exposed like gnarled hands clawing at the wet soil, while broken fences whispered secrets of a night that had thrown everything off balance. I trudged forward, boots sinking into the cold, unyielding mud with every step. Each squelch of the wet earth beneath me was a small reminder of the storm's fury, and the hollow silence that followed was almost unbearable. And then amid the rhythmic groan of branches and distant dripping, I heard it, a faint, desperate whimper, thin as a thread and fragile as glass. At first I thought it was my imagination, a trick of the wind or the echo of a distant animal. But it came again, more insistent, a high-pitched, quivering plea that seemed to pierce the dense gray around me. My heart jumped and I froze mid-step, straining to locate the source. Under the skeletal shadow of an old tractor, rusted iron groaning under its own weight, I saw a small shape, curled and shivering, trapped beneath the machinery as if the earth itself had tried to swallow it whole. His fur was mud-streaked, flattened by rain and neglect, shades of gray and brown blending with the dark soil beneath him. His eyes, impossibly wide, reflected sheer terror. It wasn't just fear of me, or the humans who had suddenly arrived in his world. It was fear of life itself, the kind that seeps into bones and muscles, the kind that whispers to a small creature that the world has no place for him. He trembled violently, trying to make himself smaller, as if invisibility could save him from the harsh, uncaring surroundings. My chest ached. How long had he been here alone? Hungry, scared, perhaps abandoned? I couldn't tell. I only knew that he had survived this long on instinct and courage that most humans rarely possess. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of wet earth, oil, and rust, curling around me like a living presence. I inched closer, careful not to startle him. The tractor loomed above, a monstrous silhouette of cold metal and jagged shadows. Every instinct urged me to reach out, to pull him free, but the terror in his eyes froze my movements. One wrong step, one sudden motion, and he might disappear further into darkness, slip between shadows and vanish like a whisper. My hands itched to act, trembling slightly with anticipation and fear for him. I knelt, lowering myself as close as possible, trying to seem small, non-threatening. "It's okay," I murmured, voice soft, low, carrying a rhythm meant to soothe. The whimper transformed into a more desperate, piercing cry, echoing beneath the tractor's iron belly. It was a sound full of history, of nights spent alone, of hunger clawing the stomach, of cold seeping into bone. I realized then that rescue wasn't only about reaching him physically. It was about connecting across species, across fear, across a chasm of suffering that had grown too wide for words alone to bridge. Mud caked my knees and thighs, cold seeping through every layer of clothing, but I remained unwilling to move, unable to leave him there. Every sound, every tiny movement made him flinch and curl tighter into himself. And yet, beneath the trembling and terror, I could sense his intelligence, the sharp, wary awareness that had kept him alive. He measured me, evaluated me, and perhaps even wondered whether help could come from the same hands that could hurt. I spoke again, letting the words float in the cold air, wrapping around the space between us like a lifeline. "You don't have to be afraid. I won't hurt you." Time became a strange, elastic thing. Minutes stretched into hours, each second measured by the faintest movements, a paw twitching, an ear flicking, the subtle rise and fall of his shivering body. The tractor's shadow became our shared universe, the world outside irrelevant. I tried to imagine his experience, how frightening it must be to be small in a world built for giants, how every sound, every vibration felt like a threat. And yet he clung to life with stubborn determination. His resilience was astonishing. I took a deep breath, smelling the mixture of wet earth, oil, and something faintly sweet, possibly the remnants of a meager meal or a stray patch of grass. It reminded me that even in despair, life seeks sustenance, connection, and hope. Slowly, I shifted closer, palm down, letting him see my hand as a promise rather than a threat. His eyes locked onto mine, dark pools reflecting pain, hunger, and mistrust. I froze, letting him decide, letting him measure the distance between fear and safety. The wind carried a soft patter of rain, the first drops of an afternoon drizzle, mixing with the earthy scent of the mud. The sound was hypnotic, almost musical, but also a stark reminder of the fragility of life. I could imagine the small creature beneath the tractor, soaking wet, alone, and trembling, wishing for warmth and shelter, craving the simplest gestures of care. And then, without warning, a paw stretched just slightly, hesitantly, into the faint light, a whisper of trust in a world that had offered him none. The sight was breathtaking. It was not just a physical act, but a symbolic one, a tiny declaration that maybe, just maybe, he could survive this, that someone could see him, acknowledge his suffering and care. My chest tightened. Rescue was no longer theoretical. It was real, urgent, and immediate. I spoke again, voice soft, carrying both encouragement and patience. The world seemed to pause. The rain hung mid-air, the tractor remained immovable, and the trembling creature beneath it was suddenly a beacon of raw, fragile hope. Every instinct told me to move faster, to scoop him up and run, to remove him from danger, but I remembered the delicate thread of trust I had glimpsed. I had to be careful. I had to respect his space while making sure he knew he was no longer alone. I whispered, breathed, and waited, letting the silence between us become a conduit for connection. He twitched, eyes following my movements, muscles coiling and relaxing. And then a faint, soft whine emerged, a sound no longer entirely of fear but tinged with curiosity, a question. Can this world be safe after all? Hours later, we would still be crouched there, mud-stained, wet, and shivering ourselves, bound to that moment of first acknowledgement. I would remember the softness of his fur, the intensity of his gaze, the way every tiny movement carried the weight of survival. Shadows and whimpers, fear and hope, mud and rain, all merged into a single, unforgettable memory. The day we found him, the tiny German shepherd hiding under the old tractor, waiting for someone to notice, waiting for someone to believe he deserved life. The first light of morning cut through the clouds like a hesitant promise. Mist lingered over the mud-streaked fields, curling around the broken fence posts and twisted branches. The storm's residue was everywhere, pools of water reflecting the gray sky, fallen leaves clinging desperately to branches, and the metallic scent of rusted machinery hanging in the cold air. I returned to the tractor, heart pounding with anticipation and fear, knowing he had not moved much through the night. Every instinct told me patience was required, but the ache of urgency pressed against my chest like a physical weight. He was still there, curled tighter than ever, fur damp and streaked with mud. His eyes flicked toward me with recognition tinged by suspicion, a cautious assessment of the human who had intruded into his fragile world. My hands itched to reach out, to scoop him into warmth, but I remembered the tremor of trust we had glimpsed yesterday. This was not a rescue that could be forced. It required negotiation, an unspoken contract between two beings divided by fear and experience. I knelt in the mud, lowering my frame to his level. My fingers hovered just above the earth, palm exposed, a universal gesture of peace. "It's okay," I murmured again, letting the words fall like rain, soft and steady, attempting to bridge the chasm of terror between us. The whimper that came in response was smaller this time, more hesitant, almost as if he were testing whether my voice was real or just another trick of the wind. The tractor loomed like a silent sentinel, shadows pooling beneath it, thick and impenetrable. I shifted slightly, careful not to startle him, letting my presence become a steady, unthreatening rhythm. He flinched at every movement, every sound, and my own body tensed, matching his fear. Mud squelched beneath me as I leaned in a fraction, breath slow, controlled, carrying the scent of reassurance. I remembered stories of animals surviving horrors, their instincts honed to detect danger in the faintest tremor of a human hand. I had to respect that, honor it, or risk losing the fragile connection we were forming. Hours passed in a quiet, hypnotic cycle of movement and stillness. I shifted closer, still talking, still offering my presence, my warmth, my patience. The air smelled of wet earth and oil, occasionally spiked by the faintly sweet scent of something decaying beneath the tractor. Each time I inched closer, he recoiled slightly, a twitch of muscle, a low growl, a soft whine. It was a negotiation of space, a dialogue without words, a delicate ballet of trust being tested and retested. I realized that my own heartbeat was tied to his movements, every rise and fall a reflection of the tension and hope entangled in the mud-stained morning. I placed a hand slowly on the edge of the tractor's shadow, letting him see that it was safe to approach. He froze, eyes locked onto mine, pupils wide and searching, muscles taut like coiled springs. He didn't move forward, yet he didn't retreat either. The subtle, almost imperceptible pause felt like an eternity. And then cautiously, a paw emerged, tentatively brushing against my glove, testing whether the warmth it felt was real or illusion. Relief coursed through me, a tidal wave of emotion tempered by the knowledge that the bridge we were building was still fragile, a single misstep away from collapse. The morning wore on, sunlight filtering through the gray clouds, casting fleeting, pale rays that danced across the mud and machinery. Birds called distantly, their voices sharp against the quiet tension, while water dripped rhythmically from the tractor's metal frame. I spoke softly, my words forming a mantra of patience, letting him acclimate to my presence, to the steady rhythm of human care. The growls and whimpers continued, but they were interspersed with pauses, moments of assessment, moments where he seemed to consider whether survival could also include trust. Finally, after what felt like an eternity measured in heartbeats, he inched forward further. Nose twitching, ears alert, he stepped into the faint sunlight, revealing more of his tiny, trembling form. I froze, letting him set the pace, letting him decide that warmth and safety were possible. Every inch he moved, every breath he took outside the shadow of the tractor was a monumental triumph over instinct, over fear, over a life that had taught him to trust no one. I extended a hand again, slower this time, palm open and flat, a silent promise that I would not hurt him. His gaze lingered, assessing, measuring, calculating the risk. And then with a small, almost imperceptible shiver, he leaned into my touch, allowing the first real connection. The tremor of his body was violent, a mixture of fear, relief, and confusion. But it was the moment we had been waiting for. A tiny declaration that maybe, just maybe, safety existed. The mud clung to our clothes, our hands, our knees, but we didn't care. Time became irrelevant. I whispered stories, nonsense words, and quiet reassurances, letting the sound of my voice become a tether to a world that had been nothing but frightening before. The tractor remained a looming, silent witness, but it no longer represented oppression. It was the backdrop to a fragile triumph, a stage for the delicate dance of patience and trust. By midday, he was moving with more confidence, exploring the edges of the blanket we had laid out, sniffing, testing, retreating, and returning. Each movement was careful, deliberate, like a tightrope walk across the invisible line between fear and curiosity. I watched, heart in my throat, knowing that any sudden movement could undo hours of progress. Yet I also knew that we were forming a bond, slow, deliberate, and profound. Trust was not given freely. It had to be earned, moment by moment, breath by breath. The afternoon sun broke fully through the clouds, casting golden slivers of light across his wet, matted fur. For a fleeting moment he paused, lifted his head, and looked at me with a gaze that was almost human in its depth. There was acknowledgement in that look, a silent understanding that we were partners in survival now, connected in a way that transcended species. I whispered, more to myself than to him, that this was only the beginning, that the path ahead would be long, but worth every muddy step and every trembling heartbeat. As the day drew toward evening, we had made progress unimaginable in the morning. He had ventured from the shadow of the tractor, taken tentative steps toward warmth and care, and allowed me to be near him without panic. Yet even as relief washed over me, I knew the journey was far from over. Fear lingered dormant but present, ready to resurface with the next sudden noise or shadow. And I realized that rescue is more than extraction from danger. It is the slow, painstaking work of connection, of teaching a life that has known only threat that there can be safety, and even affection, in a world that had shown him none. The tractor's shadow grew longer as the sun set, stretching across the mud like a reminder of where he had come from. And beneath it, the tiny German shepherd sat trembling, ears perked, eyes wide, sniffing the wind, measuring the world that had once seemed too vast and cruel. He had taken the first steps into trust, guided by hands that did not rush, voices that did not shout, and hearts that would not abandon him. And in that quiet, mud-scented field, I realized that the true reach of hands is not in lifting or pulling. It is in waiting, in watching, and in daring to offer connection to a soul too long left alone. By late afternoon, the storm had left the fields drenched but quiet, a fragile calm settling over the mud-streaked land. The air smelled of wet earth and crushed leaves, sharp with the faint tang of iron from the tractor's rusted underbelly. I crouched beside him, watching as he moved with slow, cautious steps, paws sinking into the cold, heavy mud. His fur, streaked with gray and brown, glistened with rain, and every shiver that ran through his small frame felt like an echo of all the nights he had spent alone, trembling and unseen. There was a hesitancy in his movements, a deep-rooted mistrust that made every approach tentative, every gesture delicate. I had laid out an old, frayed blanket, soaked through at the edges but offering warmth where he dared to step. The first moment he sniffed it, a tiny tremor passed through his body. He flinched at the brush of my glove when I tried to guide him gently onto the fabric, but he didn't flee. Step by cautious step, he explored the unfamiliar softness, nose twitching, ears alert, body taut like a coiled spring. The air between us vibrated with tension, fragile and electric. I whispered softly, letting the words float in the damp air, a lullaby of reassurance and patience. "It's okay, you're safe now. It's all right." Minutes felt like hours as he tested the blanket with one paw, then another. His movements were small, deliberate, a negotiation of trust with every inch. The tremors of fear were still there, but beneath them, a subtle curiosity emerged. He sniffed my sleeve tentatively, eyes flicking up at mine with a silent question. "Will this warmth hurt me?" I stayed motionless, letting him dictate the pace, willing my presence to be steady, safe, unthreatening. Every heartbeat was synchronized with his, each rise and fall a shared rhythm of fragile hope. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of hesitation, he curled into the center of the blanket, trembling violently, but surrendering just enough to let the cold ease slightly from his soaked, shivering body. Relief surged through me, sharp and overwhelming, yet tempered by caution. This was only the beginning. The first contact had been made, but the work of trust, the real, slow work, was far from over. I let him settle, breathing softly, hand hovering above him without touching, letting him feel my presence without the threat of pressure. The sun, low and weak behind thick clouds, cast a pale golden light across the field, illuminating every droplet of water that clung to his matted fur. I reached slowly, offering a gentle stroke along his back. He flinched, muscles tensing, and I froze, heart pounding, waiting for the inevitable retreat. But then, to my astonishment, he leaned slightly into my hand, small and trembling, a tentative acceptance of warmth and care. A shiver ran through both of us, the culmination of fear and relief intertwined. The first tangible bridge of trust formed from patience, presence, and unwavering attention. I wrapped the blanket carefully around him, feeling the rapid thrum of his tiny heart against my chest. Tears welled up in my eyes, unchecked, as I whispered his new name, softly, reverently, letting it carry all the hope I could muster. It was a name that would belong to safety, to belonging, to life beyond trembling and hiding. The small creature, trembling and wary, pressed closer, seeking the warmth of human contact, yet still retaining that flicker of caution, a remnant of everything he had endured. Time slowed. The tractor, once a looming shadow of terror, became an inert witness, a silent monument to the journey from fear to cautious connection. Each movement of his paws on the blanket, each subtle sniff of my hands, each flicker of the tail, all were small milestones, markers of progress measured not in grand gestures, but in the quiet negotiation of trust. I let him rest, speaking in a low murmur, telling him stories he couldn't understand. letting the sound of my voice become a tether to a world that had shown him little but neglect until now. As the light faded, I gathered him into my arms, supporting his small, trembling body, letting him feel the solid, unthreatening weight of human care. He didn't struggle, only shivered, letting the warmth seep into muscles and bones that had known only cold, wet fear. His eyes, wide and wary, occasionally flicked to mine, searching for reassurance, and I held his gaze, letting every glance carry a promise. I am here. I will not leave. You are safe. The first night in shelter was an awakening. Hay scattered across the corner of an abandoned barn offered a dry refuge from the lingering drizzle. I placed him gently on the pile, brushing away mud and debris, letting him explore cautiously. Every movement was careful, ears twitching, nose sniffing the unfamiliar space, tail tucked yet wagging in subtle flickers. He circled, paused, flinched at shadows, and then settled, curling into a ball with tentative trust. I stayed nearby, hands resting lightly on the hay, watching his breathing slow, counting the rise and fall of his chest, waiting for the first signs of relaxation. Occasionally, he would lift a paw, sniff the air, or nuzzle the blanket I had draped over him. I spoke softly through the quiet barn, letting the words be a constant, soothing presence. Each whisper, each soft exhale, was a signal that the world could be gentle, that warmth could exist without danger, that a hand could offer care without causing pain. By midnight, the shivering had diminished, though it never disappeared entirely. The air was cold and damp, pressing against the barn's wooden walls, but inside, the fragile cocoon of blanket, hay, and patience offered a sanctuary. I watched him sleep, muscles relaxing just slightly, eyes occasionally twitching as if he were dreaming of places where fear did not dictate every move. And in that moment, I realized that rescue was not a singular act of lifting him from danger. It was a commitment, a slow immersion into warmth, care, and the painstaking reconstruction of trust. The night was long, but for the first time, he was not alone. He had allowed the first real human connection, fragile as it was, to reach him. Each tremor, each small sniff, each tentative paw forward marked the beginning of healing. And as I watched him curl beneath the frayed blanket, soft breaths mingling with the distant drip of rain outside, I knew that warmth in the cold was more than physical. It was emotional, spiritual, and profoundly human. It was the bridge that would carry him from terror to hope, from solitude to trust, and from survival to life. Barning, the tiny German shepherd, had moved closer to the center of the blanket, resting his head lightly against my hand. The storm had ended, but its lessons lingered in every shiver and cautious glance. He had begun to understand that safety could exist, that human hands could be gentle, and that warmth was not something to fear. And I knew in that quiet barn, mud and hay pressed into my clothing, soaked to the bow even after rescue, the echoes of fear lingered, like a storm refusing to leave the sky. The tiny shepherd, now somewhat warmed and fed, still flinched at sudden movements, recoiled at sharp noises, and hesitated at shadows. Every creak of the old barn, every gust of wind rattling loose boards, sent tremors through his small body. The blanket that had once been a sanctuary now seemed a fragile barrier against the memories he could not forget. His eyes, wide and alert, constantly scanned, calculating risk, measuring whether this new world could ever be safe. The first days were a careful negotiation, a dialogue without words. I watched him circle, sniff, pause, then retreat. Paws pressed into hay and mud alike, marking territory and testing boundaries. Each step was deliberate, cautious, a negotiation between curiosity and instinct. I learned that patience was not optional. It was essential. Every hasty motion, every well-meaning touch could undo the fragile trust being woven between us. He had survived alone for too long, relied on fear as a shield, and now he was learning that fear could coexist with care. But the lesson was slow, punctuated by relapses of anxiety. We spent hours in quiet observation, letting him set the pace. I would sit in the barn, rain softly tapping the tin roof, murmuring stories that carried no expectations, only presence. He would approach, nose twitching, ears alert, only to dart back at the slightest shift. Each hesitation, each tremor of fear, was a reminder of the storm within him that had yet to fully pass. I often found myself holding my breath, heart sinking with his rapid, uneven rhythm, marveling at the intensity of survival etched into such a small frame. The world outside offered both promise and threat. Sunlight through the barn windows seemed too harsh at first, shadows too threatening. The breeze carried scents that could either intrigue or terrify. I watched him react to every nuance. A bird landing too close, the rustle of leaves, the scent of another dog far off in the distance. Each encounter was a test, each small triumph a victory over instinctual fear. And I realized that love in this context was not simply affection. It was careful, deliberate guidance, teaching a traumatized soul that the world could be navigable, that trust could be extended without immediate danger. Nighttime was hardest. The shadows stretched long across the barn floor, exaggerated by dim lantern light, and every sound, creaking wood, dripping water, distant hoots, took on a new intensity in his sensitive ears. He would wake suddenly, trembling, ears flat, eyes wide and glossy with pain. I would kneel beside him, hand hovering, waiting for the signal that he could accept comfort, that he could be soothed without re-traumatizing him. Slowly, tentatively, he would lean into my touch, quivering but yielding, as if saying, "I will try to trust, even though it scares me." Each of these nights was a test for both of us. Patience, empathy, and unwavering presence measured in silent exchanges, subtle gestures, and breath shared in tandem. During the day, small victories accumulated. He allowed gentle touches along his back, sniffed new spaces without running, followed me across the muddy yard for a few steps. And yet the shadow of past trauma remained. Loud voices, sudden movements, even the simple motion of a hand reaching toward him could trigger the tremor of fear. I began to understand that trauma is not linear. It is cyclical, a storm that ebbs and flows, sometimes gentle, sometimes raging. And guiding a life through it requires not only patience, but vigilance, compassion, and respect for the subtle cues that communicate either safety or threat. I often found myself reflecting on the storm he had survived. The nights alone under the old tractor, the relentless anxiety of hunger and exposure. His resilience was extraordinary, yet it came with scars, invisible yet deep. My own emotions mirrored his: frustration, hope, despair, relief. I had to remain calm, steady, because my own tension could translate into his world as danger. Trust, I realized, is a fragile ecosystem, responsive to the slightest shift in tone, movement, or presence. And in those moments, I understood that rescue was not simply about physical removal from danger. It was about living alongside fear and teaching a life that safety and care could coexist with survival instinct. There were moments of connection that felt monumental. When he finally allowed me to stroke his head without flinching, when he pressed against my hand rather than darting away, I felt an emotional surge unlike any other. Tears came unbidden, unrestrained, because each gesture, each tiny breakthrough, was a triumph over fear itself. Watching him explore, sniff, and test boundaries with cautious curiosity, I realized that these were not small victories. They were the rebuilding of a soul, piece by delicate piece. As days turned into weeks, the storm within him gradually softened. Shivers became less frequent, retreating less sudden. He wagged his tail when he was pleased, sniffed the wind with a lighter tension, and allowed himself moments of play in the small, enclosed yard. Yet even as progress unfolded, I knew the shadow of past trauma would linger. Recovery, I understood, is not about erasing memory. It is about layering new experiences atop old fears until the weight of trust can outweigh the instinctual pull of terror. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the clouds and bathed the barn in warm amber light, he paused at the doorway, nose lifted, ears alert but relaxed. For the first time, he did not retreat at a sudden gust of wind. He simply observed, considered, and chose to remain. I knelt beside him, fingers brushing lightly along his back, heart swelling at the quiet triumph. The storm within had not vanished, but it had learned to coexist with safety. Each moment of calm was earned, a testament to resilience, patience, and the quiet power of unwavering care. The night fell fully, stars peeking through gaps in the clouds, and the tiny shepherd curled beside me, muscles relaxed, breathing even and calm. The barn smelled faintly of hay and damp wood, and I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the fragile victories of the day. I realized that guiding him through the storm within required not only action but stillness, not only attention but empathy, and not only patience but a willingness to endure alongside him. The journey was ongoing, but the path forward was illuminated by small lights of trust and connection, fragile yet persistent. And in that quiet barn, mud and hay pressed into clothing, damp air clinging to skin and fur alike, I understood a truth that would shape the remainder of our journey. Rescue does not end when fear subsides. It continues in the slow, deliberate rebuilding of trust, the patient navigation of lingering shadows, and the creation of space where a life once consumed by terror can finally learn to breathe, explore, and slowly to hope. That the journey of trust, love, and resilience had only just begun. Months had passed since the day we found him trembling under the old tractor, and the world around us had shifted in subtle, unmeasurable ways. The fields, once soaked and chaotic after the storm, now stretched golden beneath the gentle sun, tall grass swaying like waves in a quiet sea. The air was crisp, carrying scents of wildflowers, dry earth, and the faint, lingering aroma of hay. The tiny shepherd, once shivering and mistrustful, now moved with a grace that belied his past, tail lifted high, paws carrying him confidently over the uneven terrain. The fear that had once defined him had not disappeared entirely. It lingered in soft flinches and careful glances, but it was tempered by the resilience he had cultivated, a testament to patience, love, and unwavering care. He darted forward suddenly, ears flicking back as if checking the wind, nose twitching at every sound. I followed at a distance, letting him lead, knowing that freedom was part of the healing process. There was no leash, no blanket to wrap him, only open space, sunlight, and the subtle reassurance that he could explore without fear of harm. Every cautious step, every joyful bound, was a declaration. This world was no longer a place of constant danger. It was a canvas upon which he could rewrite the story of his life. As he ran through the tall grass, I noticed the way the sunlight caught each strand of his fur, illuminating the resilience embedded in every movement. Memories of mud, rain, and the cold under the tractor flickered through my mind, contrasted sharply with the vibrant energy of the moment. His paws pressed into the earth confidently, ears perked, tongue lolling in joy, eyes bright and alert. Transformation was almost cinematic, a narrative of survival and growth unfolding in real time. Every bound, every playful twist was a testament to the bridge between fear and trust that had been painstakingly built over months of quiet patience. He paused suddenly at the edge of the field, nose lifted, inhaling the breeze with a cautious, deliberate attention. I knelt in the grass, heart swelling, watching the subtle dance of instincts and learned trust. Gone was the hesitation that had once made every movement a delicate negotiation. Now there was awareness tempered by experience, the kind that allows curiosity to coexist with caution. For a brief moment, he looked back at me, eyes glistening with something I could only interpret as recognition and gratitude, a silent acknowledgement of the hands, voices, and hearts that had guided him through fear into this newfound space of possibility. The old tractor loomed in the distance, rusted and silent, a monument to the days of fear and trembling that had nearly defined his existence. And yet, now it stood not as a symbol of danger, but as a backdrop to triumph, a relic of the past against which his freedom could be measured. I remembered the first time we had crouched beside it, mud and rain soaking through our clothing, heartbeats tangled with his tiny, desperate ones. The memory felt both distant and immediate, a reminder of how far we had come, and how fragile yet unbreakable the thread of trust could be when nurtured with patience and empathy. He leapt through the grass, suddenly stopping to chase a fluttering butterfly, and the sight was both joyous and poignant. The grace of his movements, the playfulness in his stance, were triumphs born not of natural abundance, but of survival and care. He had learned to move through the world with a cautious freedom, to embrace the sunlight without fear, and to trust that warmth, human and natural, was not something to flee. I let myself smile freely, realizing that the journey of healing is not linear, but cumulative, a layering of moments, choices, and consistent care that ultimately outweighs the shadow of past trauma. The breeze carried the faint scent of rain from distant clouds, mingling with the earthy aroma of the field. He paused, ears swiveling at a distant bird call, then returned to me with tentative speed, circling before sitting beside me in a moment of shared calm. I reached down, running my fingers through the fur along his neck and shoulders, feeling the steady thrum of life, strength, and cautious joy. He leaned into my touch, eyes soft, breathing steady, and I realized that the small shepherd was no longer defined by fear, but by resilience, by the bridge we had built together, by the countless hours spent in quiet presence, waiting, watching, and nurturing trust. Even the shadows no longer held the same terror for him. He moved freely along the edge of the field, ears alert, body fluid, eyes bright. The past remained, like the faint outline of clouds in a clear sky, but it no longer dictated his present. He had learned to coexist with memory and trauma, to navigate instinct and safety simultaneously, and to embrace joy as an earned right. Each movement was a negotiation of past and present, fear and hope, survival and living, and the elegance of that balance was breathtaking to witness. As the sun began to dip lower, casting long amber shadows across the field, I watched him pause, nose raised to the wind, tail flicking with subtle excitement. In that moment, time seemed to slow. The entire journey, from trembling under rusted metal to bounding freely through golden grass, was distilled into a single breathtaking image: a small shepherd, resilient, cautious, joyous, and free. The tractor, now bathed in soft evening light, was no longer a place of terror but a reference point for triumph, a reminder that life can be rewritten, that fear can be tempered by care, and that growth is a slow, delicate, and profoundly beautiful process. I knelt in the grass, watching him explore, breathe, and exist in a world that had once seemed impossibly vast and cruel. His presence was a lesson in patience, empathy, and the transformative power of consistent care. I realized that every tremor, every flinch, every cautious sniff and hesitant pause step had been essential to this moment. The narrative of rescue was never only about pulling him from danger. It was about witnessing, supporting, and guiding the quiet work of healing, a process that extends far beyond the initial act of saving a life. The sun dipped further, bathing the field in golden and amber hues, and he paused at the edge, lifting his head to inhale the evening air. For a long moment, he simply existed, alert but relaxed, free but still aware. I reached down, hand resting gently on his back, and he leaned into the warmth without hesitation. The storm within him, once fierce and unrelenting, had softened into something manageable, a whisper rather than a roar. And in that moment, watching sunlight catch each strand of fur, I understood the profound truth of this journey: that trust, patience, and love, applied consistently over time, can create miracles even in lives that have known only fear. Finally, as twilight settled and stars began to pierce the fading light, he ran once more through the tall grass, joyful and unrestrained. I watched, heart full, knowing that this was the culmination of months of quiet work, of shared breaths, tremors, and victories. The small shepherd had learned to trust, to play, to exist in joy without constant fear. The tractor rusted and silent, faded into the background, a symbol of both past terror and the triumph of resilience. And in that luminous evening, I knew the story had reached its conclusion. The cry that had once pierced the air from beneath iron had led not just to rescue, but to life fully lived, and a future defined by freedom, trust, and the quiet strength of hope.